Welcome to our training on crane operator safety. Crane operations can be risky business. Every year, thousands of workers are seriously injured or killed as a result of unsafe crane operations. You'll want all the information that you can get to make safe decisions. This presentation focuses on crane operator safety and how it relates to you and your work environment. By putting what you learn into practice, you can greatly reduce your risk of injury or death while operating cranes. Be aware that this basic safety information supplements more specific crane operator training. Crane operators must receive hands-on instruction for the cranes they will be operating. After completing this course, you should be able to identify facts associated with crane-related injuries, know how to safely establish work sites, recognize proper crane setup, recall safe crane operating procedures, and identify conditions that affect operations. When working with a crane, follow established procedures to protect your safety and reduce your risk of injury. These procedures are: always prepare the worksite in advance before crane operation, properly set up the crane, follow all applicable safe operating procedures, and be aware of and properly handle any conditions that may affect your operations. Now, let's discuss each procedure individually. To prepare a worksite for crane operations, you must determine that there is safe access to move the crane around the site, investigate surfaces to ensure adequate support, check for any power lines that might interfere with operations, arrange the work area, and set up the crane appropriately for the environment. Ensure that adequate space is available for the crane to be assembled and operated safely. On what surface do you think you should place a crane? It's okay if you aren't sure. We'll explain the correct answer. Before operation begins, a professional crane operator or other authorized operator should inspect the site and determine whether the surface conditions will provide adequate and safe support. They must determine that the soil at the site is able to support the entire crane as well as the float, which is a rigid support that attaches to an outrigger to spread the load to the surface. If the soil is not able to support the entire crane, blocking or cribbing may be needed. Cranes must be level within specifications after you apply blocking and cribbing and make outrigger adjustments. Be aware that support surfaces may also contain invisible or hidden hazards. For example, an outrigger should not be positioned where there is a buried fiber optic cable, underground tanks or septic systems, or gas, sewer, electrical, and other utilities. Indicators of possible underground interferences include physical features you can see, such as transformers, manhole covers, meters, wellheads, pumping stations, and above-ground tanks. Survey areas for underground hazards and keep them well marked. If part of the crane sinks into underground utility trenching, it may tip over. If a crane strikes underground interferences, it can cause gas, sewer, or water leaks and electrification of the crane. When setting up a crane near an excavation with vertical sides, never allow the crane to get closer to the gap than the depth of the excavation. For instance, keep a crane 7 meters away from a 7-meter excavation. For previously disturbed soils and soils that tend to shift, such as sand and gravel, The crane should not get closer than the depth times 1.5. Involve an engineer when you have questions about soil stability and proximity to excavations. Transmitters in close proximity to a crane may cause it to store an electrical charge, resulting in a shock, causing you to jump, trip, or fall. TV, radio, microwave, and cell phone towers are examples of transmitters. When working near transmitters, de-energize them if possible. Choose synthetic tag lines to reduce the risk of shock from a transmitter-induced current. When you detect a charge, take additional precautions, such as grounding the crane boom. Before you begin working, assess the work area to determine if there are any structures or conditions that would affect safe operation. To minimize the risk of work area accidents, allow a minimum space of 60 centimeters around all objects to allow for counterweight clearance. Use the appropriate signs, barricades, and signal persons, as the area around the crane and its counterweight are severe hazards to personnel on foot. Control public access to the area. To make yourself more visible, wear a high-visibility reflective vest, and if working near traffic, be sure you have been properly trained to do so. Let's see if you can recall some of the things you need to assess at the work area to determine if it is safe to begin work. Drag the appropriate description to the image of the structure. Power lines account for a number of crane fatalities. Follow these general best practices anytime you work around overhead power lines. Before you begin the work, survey the work area for hazards, and make sure all equipment and activities are located a safe distance from the power lines. Notify the owner of the lines and request his or her cooperation before work begins. The utility company should confirm the voltage in the lines and the safe working distance from them. Always consider a line energized unless the power company confirms it is de-energized and has visibly grounded the power lines or installed insulated sleeves on them. Check to be sure flagged warnings are in place to mark horizontal and vertical power line clearance distances. Only use tag lines around power lines if it is possible that the load might spin into the lines, and use polypropylene rope instead of wire rope. When working near energized lines, observe minimum clearance requirements. Qualified electrical workers must use non-conductive tools and follow other precautions when working on or near electrical lines and equipment. Staying away from power lines is the best safety option for avoiding electrocution. The table here shows the safe power line clearance distance for various line voltages. Do you see the pattern? The higher the voltage, the greater the minimum clearance distance. Assuming the power lines at this construction site are energized with 500 kilovolts, what is wrong in this scene? Before using cranes and other high-reaching equipment around power lines, make sure the utility company has confirmed the voltage in the lines and the safe working distance from them. If crane work activities will come within 6 meters of lines, you need additional precautions such as an observer, barricades to exclude non-essential personnel, pre-task plans, including steps to follow in an emergency, an insulated link, a boom cage guard, and/or a proximity device. Learn about specific precautions to follow where you work. In the event you contact power lines, it's important that you remember the following emergency procedures to reduce your chances of injury and even death. Stay in the crane unless you are forced to leave because of fire or electrical arcing. If you must leave the crane, jump clear of it, being careful to avoid touching the crane and the ground at the same time. Do not run. Take the smallest steps possible away from the crane. Shuffling away with your feet together and on the ground will minimize the potential for electric shock. Avoid touching the crane or the load. Be aware that the power may go off, then come back on several times, and if it's possible, break contact with the line safely without breaking or pulling it down. Remember, your safety is the top priority. True or false? If your crane contacts power lines, you shouldn't leave it unless your life is being threatened by fire or another emergency. Every crane should have a load chart and range diagram. To avoid tipping, operators must follow these and not exceed specified limits. Use outriggers to increase the tipping axis from the crane's center of gravity, increasing its leverage and therefore its ability to pick up a load. Maintain visibility of the boom and load block. Ensure that the boom will never contact another object and the load block will never hit the boom. Use a signal person when it is difficult to maintain visibility of the load and crane movement. During operations, another essential is to recognize and respond to hand signals and verbal communication. When hand signals are used, the person giving hand signals should be visible to the crane operator at all times. This person should wear fluorescent gloves, hats, or other apparel that will help increase visibility. During critical operations, if a voice command is given, the individual giving the command should repeat the command, and the operator should confirm it before the operation is performed. The only exception to this is a stop command, which should cause all operations to cease immediately. Operations also must be stopped if more instructions are needed, someone doesn't understand the instructions, or the operator is unable to see, or in the case of voice commands, hear the signaler. Victor is preparing to work with a crane operator and will be using hand signals to direct the work. Which action should he take? He should always stay visible to the operator and During operation, Victor is prepared. Before any pick and carry operation, check the manufacturer's guide to ensure that these operations can be performed with the particular crane you are using. Ensure that jibs, extensions, and power pin sections are not erect or in use, particularly when using a hydraulic crane. Always check the orientation of the upper to confirm that the boom is in line with the direction of travel. Travel toward the load to prevent it from lagging behind and tipping the crane. Engage the swing brake and house lock unless the manual states otherwise. Keep the load close to the crane and the boom short and low, and secure the load to the lower or use tag lines. When performing various operations, there are many precautions to keep in mind so that you are operating your crane as safely as possible. Select the operations that apply to your work, then click Continue to proceed. There are certain conditions that can affect. When performing various operations, there are many precautions to keep in mind so that you are operating. There are certain conditions that can affect the normal course of operations. The most common of these are the environment, side loading, dynamic loading, and equipment condition. Crane operations can be affected by adverse weather conditions. Keep the following safety tips in mind. Cold or freezing temperatures can affect crane parts and as a result reduce their strength. Never operate a crane when the boom is covered with snow or ice. Don't pick up or carry loads covered with ice or snow, as the added weight can be a hazard. If possible, prevent tracks, outrigger floats, and booms from freezing to the ground. Be aware that wind may be stronger farther above the ground, so you need to be extra cautious with loads in windy conditions. Wind can cause power lines to swing into your path. Water and wet conditions may also affect operations. Prevent rain or snow from getting on the clutches and brakes by making sure the door is shut on the cab. During underwater operations, remember that a load will be much heavier after you pull it out of the water. Underwater loads can also be sucked down by mud and water. Water and mud from floods can add to the weight of a load. Flooding can obscure and weaken support surfaces. Temperature extremes can cause power lines to sag, and poor visibility will slow down operations, mask obstructions, and obscure hand signals. In these cases, use voice signals instead of hand signals. Side loading and dynamic loading add weight to the original load. Side loading occurs when there is a force that pushes or pulls the boom from the side. Side loading on the boom must be limited to the amount caused by a freely suspended load. The capacity of the load must be reduced if the side load is not accounted for in the load chart. Never deliberately pull or drag a load sideways. Dynamic loading occurs when loads are added into the machine or the components of the machine by forces in motion. Dynamic loading can vary and can be increased by 3 factors. The first is the rate at which you move. The faster you move, the more dynamic forces you create. Second is the weight of the load. The greater the weight, the greater the dynamic load. Third is speed. Greater speed increases the dynamic load. Another factor that affects crane operations is the condition of the equipment. Proper maintenance will help retain safety as well as effectiveness. Equipment stored and operated outdoors is subject to weather conditions that can have adverse effects, the most damaging of which is corrosion. When inspecting for corrosion, keep in mind that internal corrosion may be difficult or even impossible to see. Finally, be aware that even normal equipment use, like regular loading and unloading, contributes to wear and tear conditions, eventually leading to equipment fatigue and other problems. Let's see if you can recall how crane operations can be affected by extreme weather. Drag the appropriate adverse weather condition to the effect it can have on crane operations. By focusing on safety at your worksite, you can avoid many of the risks that crane operators face daily. You should now be able to identify facts associated with crane-related injuries, know how to safely establish worksites, recognize proper crane setup, recall safe crane operating procedures, and identify conditions that affect operations.